I think Elon, the founder, said that it was to address the soul-crushing traffic of Los Angeles.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I've been sitting here with George talking about how to adapt to specific client requests. And he's got a real doozy that I think, it's a really great case study for you guys. I think could be very interesting. And it was with the Boring Company. It's Elon Musk he launched it. And the whole concept was very interesting, the way George had to adapt and deal with meeting their needs. So George, could you kind of walk us through, I think first, just a very brief on the Boring Company, and then we'll get into how you had to adapt.
Okay. Well, when we first started with the Boring Company, they were actually in their initial phases. They had just finished with their flamethrower. So now, the flamethrower was more of a publicity thing, but they actually did make some flamethrowers, and they did sell them. But really, the Boring Company, their core business is not flamethrowers. It is actually drilling tunnels for mass transportation or mass transit, utilizing either electric skids or kind of like a mini bus, so to speak, that can travel along at high speeds. And it was not so much of a subway system where there'd be stops every quarter mile or so, but more along the lines of an expressway where there would be a start point and end point, maybe one or two stops in between, but we're talking 5 to 10 miles in between kind of thing. So this way you're actually missing the traffic. And originally it was created, I think Elon, the founder, said that it was to address the soul-crushing traffic of Los Angeles.
Still is.
So, I don't think it's gotten much better. I wish that it had stuck a little bit better in Los Angeles, but, they are elsewhere.
Right.
So we'll see.
I believe they're in Las Vegas.
Absolutely.
I think they're headed to D.C. as well.
Yes.
One of the things is we got to go down and tour the facility, and then we also got to go into SpaceX, which that was amazing. But,
amazing.
The way they thought things out for this company was just absolute brilliance. I mean, as you can imagine, when you're digging those tunnels, you had to remove a lot of dirt. You had to haul it out. Well, instead of hauling it out themselves, they would get it out to streets, and then they had a machine that would press them into bricks that were just as strong as cinder block, and they would give those bricks away so people would come and get those free bricks and haul the dirt away.
And use it for construction purposes.
Yeah, use it for construction. It was absolutely, the brilliance was there. But now you had some unique challenges with this because of their requirements. Can you walk us through, if you had to have, you said it was every mile you had to have a maintenance?
A maintenance hatch, at least 1 mile, and this was more of a regulatory thing where they, obviously if something goes wrong, they need to be able to get down into the tunnel as quickly as possible and try and address it, and whatever it may be.
Okay.
So we definitely had a couple of those. That was one of the challenges because they didn't want to necessarily spend millions of dollars buying properties just for a maintenance port.
Right.
So instead, we would approach landowners and talk to them about leasing the ground or getting the ground rights, underground rights, to be able to do so in just that portion of itself.
How deep were these tunnels?
The tunnels were 30, 40 feet. And
so they're not far below the building.
They're not that far below the building. We're typically looking at properties that would not necessarily be have the foundation footprint that's right up to the sidewalk. So otherwise you wouldn't be able to really go into it anyways or create a portal. So there still had to be room through a parking area or something that we could actually put some sort of hatch type portal.
So you had to negotiate all the mineral rights and all that, right?
Well, not necessarily mineral rights because they weren't taking it, but really it's more the ground rights, the rights to the subterranean ground.
Right.
So, that was a lease, long-term lease for a small. So this was additional added income that typically a owner wouldn't be able to have. Very much like, let's say, a cell tower wanting to be put on the property. They would go for the air rights, and instead we're just going for the ground rights.
But wouldn't that restrict you from developing down
It does.
in the future?
It does. It does for the landlord, or I should say, it may for the landlord. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. It depends on where we negotiate the viewport or the maintenance hatch, mm-hmm. Where it's going to be on the property itself. It could potentially affect the development, especially if it's you won't be able to necessarily develop over it.
Right.
So you might have to cut it short of where it is and be able to still give access and accessibility to that. So
you just had to lease the ground rights.
Absolutely, you would lease it out, and some landlords, of course, that was actually an issue with them. That what am I going to do? I won't be able to develop it. It may affect the value of my building as a develop. But the nice part about Los Angeles is it's pretty infill.
Yeah.
And as such, a lot of the properties are already at their highest and best use. So those are the properties that we target to be as efficient as possible. And this is how we're adapting to our clients' needs. So we would actually map out along that 1 mile route and where they are and where potential properties that we could actually go after that were already developed to their highest and best use. So this way we wouldn't have to worry about the landlord coming back and saying, or the owner of the property coming back and saying, this may be an issue for future development. Well, it's already developed as high as it can be. It's already at its best use right now. So they're not going to tear it down and redevelop something that's less. So with that in mind, that's how we're adapting. We're not just looking at just any old property because any old property wouldn't necessarily work. We also had to adapt quite a bit when it came to the NDAs, the non-disclosure agreements. But also it's not so much that it was the NDA where we couldn't talk about the ownership and the buying entity, but it was more about positioning it so that our client had the best and most favorable terms to negotiate a purchase of the property or lease of the property. Obviously, if they know that it's a multi-billionaire that is backing the company that's trying to buy the property.
Raise the price on you.
A lot of people will just raise the price, whether it's a sale or a lease. And we couldn't really have that happen. We're trying to get the best deal for everybody. A fair deal for the owner, best deal that we can for our client. And, that's how we had to adapt by really coming to terms. And it became more of a and also, the next kind of hurdle that we had to overcome is that, we had some leeway in putting the maintenance hatches a mile apart or so. It could be three quarters of a mile, and then the next one had to be within a mile of that. So, we had some leeway where we could play around with it. But what we didn't have leeway with is the starting point and the ending point. So
what was at each one? At your starting point, was there like a big building that what was it?
Different concepts. They had they called them stations, or they would be stations.
And what was in those stations?
So essentially, it's almost like a little elevator shaft that would drop down the car. And the original concept was that your car, if it was adapted and connected with hooks, a special hooks, you could actually go right down onto a skid. And it's an electric skid that was based off of the Tesla models, and it was essentially a Tesla bottom frame without the top part of it. It just came right on it, connected to it. And then it would take you to your final destination, your stop. And then it would have another elevator that would bring you back up and you'd take off. Okay. In addition to that, there were some other larger stations that would also have the ability for pedestrians to come in. Because they also had, in addition to the skids, they had kind of like, think of it as a Tesla, but with a clear bubble over it, because you didn't really have to, didn't care what it really looked like. At this point, it's public transportation or mass transportation, and it would be filled with a row of seats. And a couple rows of seats, and they would sit down and just go kind of like a mini bus. So they would also have pedestrian traffic there, and then of course they'd have a retail or component kind of center that would be at the top.
So did those people have to go from point A to point B, or could they stop in between?
No, they'd have to go to point A to point B.
No matter what.
Now that doesn't mean that there wasn't a point C or D. So, but that was the whole concept was to save the traffic congestion, and if it was stopping every quarter mile or every half mile and trying to come up, number one, we'd have to have stations everywhere. Okay, which would be economically unfeasible for this.
Well, it had to be under public thoroughfares, didn't it?
Well, the boring was under public thoroughfares, but all of the actual, like when you were going in and going down, had to be on private land. So all that had to be negotiated and or leased or purchased. So
this was quite a puzzle you had to put together.
It was a fun puzzle, though. I love working like this because I love trying to come up with solutions to problems that may, and realistically speaking, even the midpoints weren't as difficult as it was the starting and the endpoints, because starting and endpoints we really had one, maybe at most 3 block. That we could actually find. And so we had to find a property that was within those 1 to 3 blocks that was deliverable, could be vacated within the next year, and then redeveloped for the type of property for the type of asset that we're looking for. So the zoning also played a factor.
So it wasn't a ton of cold calling.
It wasn't a ton of cold calling, but surprisingly, it was different cold calling. Sure. Because, with this, it's not so much that, there obviously we're looking at the different databases for the commercial companies and commercial properties out there, because you never know, something may pop up.
Right.
But realistically speaking, it's not going to be there, so we had to make those calls. We had to feel, but more importantly, we had to take a different tack to it. We couldn't really tell them who the client was, so a lot of it was relationship based and really creating that relationship with the landlord and or the broker that was representing that landlord.
Yeah. Are they stopped doing that here, right? The boring company?
Los Angeles is on hold indefinitely, I think, right now.
Okay.
They don't have plans at this point that I'm aware of to restart that. They are in Las Vegas. They did complete a tunnel for the Las Vegas Convention Center that goes from the north end to the south end. It actually takes a 45-minute walk and condenses it down to a 1.5-minute ride.
Right.
So that saves a ton of time right there. Because that's the majority of, in the convention center, most of the people walk there, and that place is huge. Oh, yeah. They're also connecting that to Resorts World, so that's going to take a couple more years, and then they have another, the next stage as well after that.
Okay. All right. Well, George, this has been very interesting. I think what I want to do is the next one, let's talk about John Paul DeJoria and the stuff that he did. John Paul is the owner of Paul Mitchell Hair Care Products and Patron Tequila and a list of other companies, and he's just a fabulous human being.
Yeah.
And he's really nice.
Yeah, sure, he is. He's, as I always say, the nicest billionaire I know.
Yeah, he really is. So it was a real pleasure to work with. So, George, thank you very much. For those of you who are watching, thank you for watching. If you could, please give us a like. And if you haven't done so, please give us a subscribe.